So while everyone's getting settled, because everyone's here nice and early to get the coffee, which is great, and I won't let the actual program begin early in case people are straggling in, but just wanted to say a few quick words. I think I know most of you, but if I haven't met you all, my name is Elizabeth Ivory. I'm the chair of NLC. Welcome tonight, especially to the people who are here for the first time. Can you show me your hands if you are? Fantastic. So nice to see you. Welcome. Okay, this brings us to the end of our fall program that fell off the wall, space. But I'm not going to talk a lot about that now because many of you have been here for most of them, and tonight's going to be a fantastic ending to the program. But do let me take a few minutes to thank the members of the NLC board and our volunteers, many of whom are here tonight. So Kathy Bennett, David Kent, Christine Kwiatkowski, Wayne Lang, Peter McLaughlin, Don McMaster, Joanne O'Sullivan, Barb Woolley, and Grace Rivers. We depend on them so much, and they're just fantastic. And a very special thanks to Karen Stanworth, who I don't think is here tonight. She has led the program committee for the last 3 very successful series, so we owe a big debt of gratitude to Karen. Thanks also to Joel and Kevin, our AV team members, whose videos keep getting better and better. I think they're fantastic. This year I know people have really appreciated the screen-in-screen version that they've produced, which is so great. So thank you guys. And also to Nedra, who many of you deal with, who is our amazing administrative support person, and I think everyone appreciates how patient she is with ticket questions and so on. So that's the team, and thank you very much for coming out. So one more thing I would like to say that is we're really gratified that NLC's place in the community keeps evolving. I look back over the last year. So our connections with First Nations experts helped us communicate wider perspectives on trees and on space. Our concert collaboration with 10,000 Villages helped support their successful tree planting campaign. We introduced young presenters from Horizons of Friendship. They educated us about migrant workers, and we introduced them to David Piccini's office so they could get some help with grant writing. We have also delivered them, I guess inadvertently through us, some volunteers for their organization, which is also great. And this fall, we started up a student program. And I think we have at least one student here tonight. I saw someone. At every program in space, we've had students come out. So thanks to Joanne O'Sullivan for spearheading that initiative. So we couldn't have done any of this without your support. Mostly then, we thank you, our audience. If you have recently joined up or renewed as a connector, that's great. There's still time to do so and get a tax receipt for this year. So you can see Dawn and Wayne on the way out. But now, to the program. I think it's 7:30. Is it 7:30? Okay. So I'm going to ask David Kent, a board member and a member of our program committee, to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. As Elizabeth said, this is our final presentation in the space series, and tonight we have Professor Michael Byers, who's going to be speaking to us on the topic of who owns outer space. Before we get going, though, I'd like to acknowledge that Coburg, where we are today, is located in the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa nations. And we offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care and teachings about our Earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings. Now, the introduction. The normal rubric when you start an introduction is to say you're privileged to do whatever, but I'm both privileged and excited, having had dinner with Michael tonight, to introduce him because he is superbly positioned to talk to us tonight on who owns outer space. He has a PhD in international law. International law is an extremely slippery area of law, so this is a terrific accolade just right there. He was a research fellow at Oxford. He taught law at Duke, and since 2004, he's been the Canadian Research Chair in Global Politics and International Law at UBC. His work focuses on, and I use the word focus only because that was in his CV, but when you've got this many areas, the word focus is not the perfect word for it. Work focuses on outer space, Arctic sovereignty, the laws of both the sea and of war, and climate change. He is the co-director of the Outer Space Institute, which is how we first got onto him because that's such a cool title. And he's an award-winning author. His book, Who Owns Outer Space, is available at the table at the back. For that book, he and his co-author, Aaron Boley, sorry, I can't read my own writing, thanks, Michael, won the 2023 Donner Award, which is presented to the book on public policy, the best book on public policy in the year, and Michael is one of only 2 people who have ever won the Donner Award twice. Last, but definitely not least, Michael lives on Salt Spring Island and is chair of the Salt Spring Forum, which is a lifelong learning organization, a little bit like this one, and is one of the reasons why he responded quickly and very generously when we reached out to him to see if he would come to us tonight. So without more, Michael.
Thank you, David. I organize events like this, so I have set out to be your easiest guest ever.
No slides, yay!
No slides. No hassle. And I will keep to time because I have a timer. I wish my guests would use timers. The Salt Spring Forum was created 15 years ago by myself and a few friends and neighbors on Salt Spring Island who resolved to bring interesting and influential people to our small community to enrich our lives through community-based discussions. This Saturday evening, I will be introducing Rachel Notley, the former Premier of Alberta. And the following week, someone else will be introducing Phil Johnson, one of the co-founders of the Tyrol Museum of Paleontology, who was the inspiration for a character in the movie Jurassic Park. So we do all kinds of weird and wonderful stuff, and I've been looking at your website and saying there's more than a few similarities here, David. And I know how incredibly informed, engaged, and curious audiences like this are. So I will stick to time because I want to hear from you. Okay, just a little bit of water. In mid-December 2015, my then 15-year-old son came to me and said, I know what I want for Christmas. And I looked at him and I said, okay, hit me. I knew it was going to cost some money. And he said, well, it's not going to cost that money because I found some really cheap airplane tickets to Orlando. Now, I knew he didn't want to go to Disney, right? Because my son is high-functioning autistic. He's a geek. And he had been geeking out on space for the previous 5 years. So he wanted us to fly to Orlando because he wanted to go to Cape Canaveral. Because there was going to be a rocket launch that he, in his maximum geekness, had determined was going to be a world-changing rocket launch. And he wanted to be there, and he needed me to be with him because he was only 15 years old. And I had the credit card. So, quite literally, 3 days later, at around 7:30 at night, I am standing on the bank of the Banana River with 15,000 people who were all high-functioning autistic spectrum geeks. And 12 kilometers away, there is a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket on a pad. And I am expecting to be impressed, slightly, maybe a bit more than slightly. I was really happy to be spending time with my son. And then the 9 engines on the Falcon 9 lit up. And let me explain. It was after dark, but it was more than that. It was a totally clear night. So it was perfect viewing conditions, right? And this thing lifts off the pad. You can't hear it yet. You just see the rocket lifting, and then you see this brightness. And it's brighter than the sun. Right? It's just incredibly bright. And I noticed that a lot of the space geeks are putting on sunglasses. I didn't have sunglasses with me because it was nighttime. And this thing lifts up, and then we get hit by the shock wave. And I feel my internal organs vibrating, right? It's a sensory overload. How many people here have been to a space launch? Some of you will, this is all familiar to you, right? Yeah, so this is cool. Okay, I am impressed, this is cool. And this rocket goes up, and it goes up and goes up, and after about 2 minutes, we can see, because we can see everything, because it's a totally clear night. The rocket separates. There's the first stage and the second stage, which has the fairing on top that's carrying the satellites. So the first stage and the second stage separate. The second stage starts up its engine and proceeds upwards. And the first stage does a 180-degree turn. It flips and fires its engines again. And all of a sudden, it looks like I've got an ICBM heading straight for me. This thing, when it's standing on the pad, is 19 stories high, right? And it's just turned around and it's coming right back to Cape Canaveral. And so it fires its engines, it starts coming back, and then it flips again, 180 degrees, and fires its engines again to do the atmospheric reentry. Okay. And then it comes down, and we can see it, and it's coming right down to Cape Canaveral Air Force Base, and then just before it gets to the ground, a couple of the engines start up again, and this thing lands on 4 legs. Right? So there are 15,000 people going completely crazy. I'm going completely crazy. Like, this is straight out of all those sci-fi movies and books that, we all were aware of or read or watched when we were young. In fact, anyone here from the UK will know about the Thunderbirds. Okay, I just described Thunderbird 1 to you, right? And a tiny back portion of my brain is still functioning in a rational way. And I'm thinking, I've just seen something historic here. That these men and women have transformed a form of human transportation. It's not as important as the invention of the wheel, but it could potentially be as important as the invention of the steam engine. Because you see that first stage that they landed, it's about the same size, has about the same level of technology in it, and costs about as much to make as a Boeing 787 Dreamliner. And if we threw away the airline jets after just one use, none of us would be able to afford to fly, right? That's the change, because they can use these rockets 12 times. They've done that since. 100 times, haven't done that yet, but they're on track to do that. And every time they reuse one of the rockets, they're knocking 70, 80% off the cost of lifting mass to orbit. So it's revolutionary. So when we saw this happen, there were just over 2,000 operational satellites in Earth orbit. December 2015. There are 13,000 today. Roughly 7,000 of them belong to SpaceX because they're able to use their reusable rockets. They launch 50 satellites at a time. And these satellites are not small. They're 750 kilograms each. They launch 50 of them at a time. And they are creating what's called a mega constellation of communication satellites, of broadband satellites in low Earth orbit, building a shell at 550 kilometers above the Earth. But other space companies haven't yet developed reusable rockets, but they're miniaturizing the technologies. They are achieving other advances and new applications, and the space economy has literally exploded in just the last 6 or 7 years. It's like what was happening in space from 1957, when Sputnik was launched, until Apollo 11 landed on the moon. The pace of change in space is very similar to what happened then. Some of it is driven by geopolitical rivalry, mostly between the United States and China. But most of it now is being driven by the commercial sector, by what's called new space. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. I can't compete with Marc Garneau talking about being an astronaut, because I'm not an astronaut, and I'm not nearly as qualified as he is in any respect. But I have spent the last almost 9 years thinking about how this rapid advancement of commercial space is not only creating opportunities, but also creating risks. And the individual that is at the center of my story is Elon Musk. I used to be a fan of Mr. Musk. But he's an important character in the story because despite his many and growing flaws, he was the visionary who realized that building a reusable rocket wasn't a question of the physical characteristics of the rocket. It was improving the software so it could make the tens of thousands of minute adjustments in milliseconds to enable you to bring this thing down straight and land it. It was software. Just like you want to build a self-driving car, it's not about the car, it's about the software. And so I'm going to tell a story with a villain in the middle of it, which always makes for a better story. But it's a story about this rapid advancement and the challenges that it causes. So in around 2018, astronomers started noticing that the images produced by their telescopes had streaks of light on them, caused by the increasing number of satellites in orbit. And you see, it can be dark where we are here in Cobourg, Ontario, but the sun is still shining. And there are satellites that as they cross the sky, and in low Earth orbit they are moving across the sky, will still be catching the light of the sun as it comes around the planet. So you get these very bright points of reflection of sunlight, even though it's dark where you are, whether it's Cobourg, Ontario, or a $20 billion observatory on top of a mountain in Chile. And I say 20 billion just to emphasize that astronomy is something that governments have invested many tens of billions of dollars in over the years. This is not simply an intellectual exercise. It's a massive big science investment that governments have made, now being altered, potentially destroyed by a startup run by an entrepreneur who probably doesn't care about astronomy. And so the light pollution has been an issue. The astronomers, because it's big science, it's the world's oldest science, with massive amounts of funding, are supremely well organized at the global level, and they've mounted a massive campaign to raise awareness about this problem. They now have observer status at the United Nations. They've been lobbying government officials. They've been told by government officials to work with industry to figure it out. And industry pretends to work with them while launching thousands of satellites. The astronomers then realized that it wasn't just a question of light pollution affecting their optical telescopes, but these satellites are communication satellites. So they're using radio spectrum, they're broadcasting and they're receiving. And although they are operating on parts of the spectrum that have been allocated to them by national regulatory agencies working in partnership with the International Telecommunication Union, on the edges of their spectrum use, they're getting noise that's creeping into the spectrum that's reserved for radio telescopes. And then it's emerged that there are mechanical moving parts within these satellites. And if your radio telescope is a modern, high-capability telescope, you could hear someone burp on Mars. Right? These things they're designed to reach into deep space across hundreds of millions of light years, right? And so a satellite that's at 550 kilometers that has a reaction reel that's turning and creating a small amount of noise is creating a cascade of noise in this radio telescope on Earth. Big problem. Governments don't know what to do about this. Canadian government sunk a bunch of money into a big radio telescope that's both in South Africa and Australia. And yet this issue is new and now problematic, but no one knows what to do. Except maybe launch a few big telescopes into space beyond the satellites, which is what the James Webb telescope is all about. But you can't do that with radio telescopes. They're just too big. So the light pollution, the radio pollution, there's a problem. We're losing astronomy. We're also losing our own access to the night sky. I imagine that some of you live in fairly dark places. It's probably one of the privileges of living outside of the big city, right, is being able to go out on a clear night and see the stars. Where I live on Salt Spring Island, we're far enough away from Vancouver and Victoria that I can see the Milky Way, right? And I won't be able to see the Milky Way in 10 years' time if these satellite companies continue to launch thousands and thousands of satellites, because there will be so many streaks of light in the sky that my brain won't be able to process what are stars and what are satellites. That's bad enough, right? My grandchildren, when I have some, hopefully one day, won't be able to appreciate the night sky. And then there are the wild animals. Just think about all those migratory birds that navigate by the stars. What's going to happen to them in a busy, light-polluted sky? So these are big issues that are only just now starting to penetrate into the minds of decision makers. And the rate of change is absolutely exponential. So I mentioned there are 30,000 operational satellites today. But each of these satellites needs to be registered for radio spectrum at the International Telecommunication Union. And these applications for radio spectrum go through national regulatory agencies to the ITU, which is located in Geneva. And a couple of brilliant young people who work with me went and counted how many satellites had been filed at the ITU. Over 1 million. So you can see where industry is going, right? And these satellites do some pretty awesome things. So SpaceX's constellation, which is called Starlink, is radically improving the lives of northern Canadians. So I was in Cambridge Bay, Nunavut in March, and every second house had a pizza box-sized Starlink terminal outside. Right? All of a sudden they have the same access to the internet as all of you, right? Now, many people are just playing games, right? But other people are doing teleeducation, right? There are small businesses starting up in Canada's north that are starting up because they finally have access to the kind of internet connectivity that we've benefited from in the south. So there are positives with this. In February 2022, on the day of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the principal communications provider to the Ukrainian military saw its service go down because of a cyber attack. So it was an American company called Viasat. It was providing communications from satellites in geosynchronous orbit, 35,000 kilometers above the Earth. And it just went down because of a cyber attack that literally destroyed tens of thousands of ground-based modems on the morning of the Russian invasion. You can guess who did it, right? Now, Elon Musk is a complicated figure. But within 24 hours, he stepped up and he said, I've turned on Starlink coverage over Ukraine. And I've chartered 2 Hercules transport aircraft. And we are flying thousands and thousands of our ground terminals into Ukraine. I'm no longer a fan of Elon Musk, but he may have changed the course of the Ukraine war. Because within 48 hours, the Ukrainian military had connectivity again. That's the power of these systems, right? Back to a negative. We have a space debris problem. It's not a new problem. Over the course of human activity in space, we have abandoned thousands of rocket bodies in Earth orbit. I mean, SpaceX, in a sense, is like exhibiting best practice by actually bringing them back and landing them. But there are still 2,000 rocket bodies in Earth orbit, some of them with a mass of over like 10 tons. And they're all coming back one day, which is interesting to think about. There are also lots and lots of defunct satellites. And over the decades, there have been collisions. And every time there's a collision between 2 large objects in orbit, it turns into tens of thousands of small pieces, each of which cumulatively has a much larger surface area than the original 2 objects. Larger surface area increases the chance of a subsequent collision, right? So we're starting to see some knock-on collisions. Satellite operators are now, when they operate when they launch a set number of satellites, they're launching a buffer of satellites because they know that a certain percentage will get killed by debris. It's a tragedy of the commons that we face in low Earth orbit. It's a space that's open to every actor, and those who get there first can make a lot of money. But when too many people come and start to use it, the benefit decreases and the cost goes up. It's like the common in the middle of the English village, right? It can handle a certain number of cows and sheep, but because there's no restraint on who does what, you can overload the common and destroy it for everyone. It's a tragedy of the commons. And the one way I like to explain it is that when I was a kid living in Ottawa, TV Ontario had a documentary that they kept running about the garbage barges coming out of New York City. Some of you would have seen it, right? And it was celebrated. This is really cool, right? This is how New York gets rid of its garbage. It takes it out on a barge and it dumps it into the ocean. And because the ocean is really big, this is a really good means to get rid of our garbage, right? It's too big to care, right? It's a bottomless sink for all of our junk. Well, now we have an ocean garbage crisis, right? Especially ocean plastics, right? The ocean is not unlimited. Earth orbit is not unlimited. And exacerbating factors further, all of these satellites and all of these defunct rocket bodies and all of these pieces of debris, they're all moving at 17 kilometers per second or something crazy like that. And they're not all going the same direction, right? Most orbits are not circular. Most of them are elliptic. And not all orbits go around the equator in the same direction. Some of them go around the poles, and other inclinations. And so it's, I don't know, it's a little bit like driving on the 401, right? There's just stuff coming at you from all directions, right? And it's okay up to a certain point, but when you get too many things coming, too many things, and they're not slowing down because they can't slow down, right? You get a pile up. So we have a debris crisis. And then some smart people said, well, you know, we can stop contributing to debris by bringing these satellites down at the end of their operational lives and steering them into an atmospheric reentry, at which point they'll burn up. And that indeed is the SpaceX model. They're building a constellation of 42,000 satellites times 750 kilograms. And at the end of their short operational lives of 4 to 5 years, they're all steered into the atmosphere where they burn up. But there's a very simple rule of physics, which is that mass never disappears. So if you take a 750 kilogram satellite and you put it through an atmospheric reentry, you get 750 kilograms of aluminum particles deposited in the upper atmosphere, times several thousand each year. So Elon Musk and SpaceX are engaged in a geoengineering experiment. It is possible that all of this aluminum that they're putting into the upper atmosphere will reflect a lot of solar energy back into space and slow climate change. It's possible. I'm pretty sure Elon Musk thinks that's what's going to happen, because he's always the smartest guy in the room. But it's equally possible that it could be trapping a lot of heat on the planet. And I'm trying to decide whether I want to ruin your sleep tonight. Because it's also possible, I'm going to ruin your sleep, sorry. I'll end the evening on an optimistic note. But it is also possible that these billions of tiny particles of aluminum will provide locations for the chemical reactions that destroy ozone. In fact, it's more than possible. That's what the atmospheric chemists tell me could well happen. Now, the most successful international treaty in history saved the ozone layer, the Montreal Protocol. Because in the late 1970s, early 1980s, scientists in different countries identified that chlorofluorocarbons used in refrigeration units were escaping and going to the upper atmosphere and destroying ozone. There were alternative chemicals available for use in refrigeration. So countries came together and they said, we're going to ban the use of chlorofluorocarbons to save the ozone layer. They did it. 193 countries have ratified this instrument. The United Nations Environmental Program estimates that that treaty is saving, right now, is saving 2 million lives a year by preventing fatal skin cancers. And it's possible that Elon Musk and SpaceX are going to reverse all that progress through this experiment in geoengineering. Let's see, what else can I tell you that's scary? I should also talk about the security dimension of all this. I've already mentioned that Elon Musk provided satellite coverage to the Ukrainian military, provided communications, and it's turned into an awesome weapon of war, this satellite system. So to give you just two examples, you have a drone operator who's got a $10,000 drone that he bought at Home Hardware, or someone bought for him at Home Hardware. It's got a GoPro on it and a little radio transmitter that can transmit back to the operator by line of sight. And he flies it over the front line, and he's got a video stream, right? But he's got to get the video stream to the artillery unit that's 25 kilometers behind him. So he's got a little pizza box-sized Starlink terminal. So he sends his live feed up to Starlink. It's bounced down to another pizza-sized box at the artillery unit. And all of a sudden, they're doing their targeting at something that's 30 kilometers away with a live feed from the drone that's just 200 meters up in the sky, dramatically improving the effectiveness of the Ukrainian artillery. Or to give you another example, they've put these pizza box-sized ground stations on the backs of little small Zodiac fast boats. And then on the front of the boat, they put a Westcam optical system built in Hamilton, Ontario. And they can drive this fast boat from 1,000 kilometers away because they've got the Starlink connection. They've got the live feed from this incredible optical unit that's usually used on like armed drones and things like that. Now it's on a little fast boat in the Black Sea. And to make the little fast boat deadly, they put 350 kilograms of high explosives in the front. And then they go hunting for Russian warships. Remember how the Russians, early in the war, closed the Black Sea? The Black Sea is open because of little fast boats with Westcam optical units and Starlink terminals, changing the course of a war. Now, the problem there with that example is that Vladimir Putin talks to Elon Musk. Elon Musk talks to the Russians. And the Russian ambassador to the United States convinced Elon Musk that this destruction that was being caused to the Russian fleet in the Black Sea would lead to a nuclear conflict. And so in a response to a Russian request, Elon Musk turned off coverage over the Black Sea. So all of a sudden, the course of the war is being changed in another direction by a very powerful, mentally unstable person who can be influenced by the last person he spoke with. I'm not talking about Donald Trump. I'm talking about Elon Musk. The Biden administration responded to this by saying, we would like to buy 500 of your satellites because we don't want you to have control over what they do. That was the immediate response of the Biden government. The immediate response of the Canadian government was to give a Canadian satellite company called Telesat $1 billion to build a Canadian constellation of 198 satellites so that Canada would not be reliant on Elon Musk. And Steve Chase, who's arguably the best reporter in this country, is reporting from Taiwan right now about how Taiwan wants to buy Telesat coverage so it's not dependent on Elon Musk, because Elon Musk also talks to President Xi Jinping of China. So all of a sudden these satellite systems are enmeshed in this conflict, or potential conflict domain. It gets worse. In November 2021, so just 4 months before the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia launched a ground-based missile and struck a defunct Soviet satellite at an altitude of 483 kilometers. And every space expert in the world scratched his or her head and said, what's going on here? We've known for decades the Russians could do this. They don't need to test this capability. I mean, they were the first country in space. They know how to do rockets. So what is this? What's this about? And also it created debris because they had a highly energetic collision between essentially the kill unit on the end of the missile and this 2-ton, 3-ton satellite. Debris all through the lower reaches of low Earth orbit on elliptical orbits. They put 50 of Russia's own military satellites at risk. They put the cosmonauts and astronauts on the International Space Station at risk. Mission Control in Moscow and Houston ordered the astronauts and cosmonauts into their hardened return capsules because of the risk from that debris. And of course, they put satellites from all other countries at risk too. Not just NATO satellites, but also Chinese and Indian satellites. So why would Russia do this? It wasn't a demonstration of capability. Everyone knew they could do this. It had to be a demonstration of their willingness to put their own people and their own equipment at risk. Like, we are crazy enough to do this, to create a debris-rich environment in a very valuable part of Earth orbit. And so everyone is now like freaking out about the possibility of this happening again, or about what are called proximity operations, where one satellite comes close to another satellite and then fries its electronics with a laser, right? Or cyber attacks or jamming attacks. And the dynamic is all of a sudden changing in the direction of people talking about space as a theater of war. And particularly talking not about Russia as the risk, but China as the risk, because China is the growing superpower. We actually understand how Russia works. We've been dealing with Russia since, the end of World War II as an adversary. China is new. China has people concerned. China is developing space capabilities. They just brought back a sample from the far side of the moon. And so I'm really worried about escalation in this domain. And it's not helped now by the intended appointment of some serious China hawks to the new Trump administration. It's not helped by the arrival of people in the State Department and the Department of Defense in Washington, D.C. who don't understand diplomacy and international law and cooperation and trust. So I'm worried that space will become a war-fighting domain, that we will see continued expansion of the number of satellites, this race for both commercial and military dominance, and ultimately the loss of most of these orbits for my generation, my kids' generation, my grandkids' generation. Any debris that's above 600 kilometers is going to be there for at least 100 years. But optimism, very quickly. We have been cooperating in space since the very beginning. Sputnik, 1957, is usually talked about as the beginning of a space race between the Soviet Union and the United States. It was like the beginning of a contest for military supremacy, and you know the narrative, right? We've been told this narrative our whole lives. Sputnik was one of the Soviet Union's contributions to the International Geophysical Year. It was actually a science contribution. You know, the Americans wanted to be the first to have a satellite, and they managed to do that the following year. Then the Russians beat them to putting the first human being in space, and you know the politics of that. The Americans were the first to make it to the moon, and then they kind of stopped doing the space race thing because they'd won the race, and that was it. That was the beginning, except in terms of international cooperation. So, 1957, Sputnik goes up. 1958, the United Nations General Assembly creates the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which remains functional today. I attended the plenary session of what's called COPUOS in Vienna last summer, and I saw cooperation between the United States, Russia, China, India, right? Getting things done below the radar of the journalists and the pundits, but making things work on issues like mitigating the threat from space debris. In Geneva, the International Telecommunication Union, which I mentioned earlier, it wasn't created during the space race, it was created before the space race. In 1865, off by a century. 1865 is the International Telegraph Union. And with the advent of human activity in space, it renamed itself the International Telecommunication Union, and it now assigns spectrum for all uses of radio spectrum, both on Earth and in space. In 1967, the Soviet Union and the United States led the negotiation of the Outer Space Treaty, the Constitution for the Heavens, which, among other things, bans the deployment of nuclear weapons in space, prohibits the national appropriation of the moon and other celestial bodies, requires countries to rescue astronauts in distress, requires countries to exercise due regard for the interests of other countries in their activities in space. It's a real treaty. In 1968, they adopted a more detailed treaty on the rescue of astronauts, because the big concern then was that early in the space age, that an American capsule would come down in the Russian Far East, or a Soviet capsule would come down in Alaska, and the imperative to rescue human beings in distress was very strong, and they wanted to make sure that their astronauts and cosmonauts would be rescued and returned. That was shortly followed by a convention on liability for damage, both in space and on the surface of the Earth, by a convention on the registration of space objects. There was also some remarkable cooperation. Again, this was all happening during the Cold War. In 1975, a Soyuz spacecraft docked with an Apollo spacecraft in Earth orbit. They opened the hatches, they shook hands, and they spent 24 hours together. It was during détente, when the Soyuz Apollo project was an indication of goodwill in space. In 1979, the Soviet Union, the United States, Canada, and France came together and created what's called COSPAS-SARSAT. So it's based on a treaty, and it's about the sharing of rescue signals from people in distress. The Secretariat for COSPAS-SARSAT, an international organization, is in Montreal. You've never heard of it. It saves thousands of lives each year. Because when someone is in distress, if they're a prospector, if they're an Inuit hunter, if they're a pilot on a plane, a mariner on the ocean, something goes wrong. On land, they have to set off the beacon manually. If it's on a boat or a ship, it sets off when it contacts water. So you put it under the gunnel in a dry area, except if the boat is sinking. Then it sets off. And on an aircraft, it's triggered by a certain G-force, i.e. the impact of a collision. It literally saves thousands of lives each year. And today, it's totally functional. So if I'm kayaking off Salt Spring Island and I get into trouble and I set off my $400 beacon, there's a pretty good chance that a Russian satellite will pick up the beacon. and send the location of the emergency call to the Canadian Forces Search and Rescue base in Esquimalt, BC. And they will phone my cell phone. And when I don't answer, they will phone my wife. And when she doesn't know where I am, they'll dispatch a helicopter to come and pick me out of the ocean. Literally, that's how it works. Seamlessly, flawlessly. China's involved now also. COSPIS, RSAT, cooperation in space, saving lives. It's fantastic. In 2000, countries came together along with some private satellite companies to create the Charter on Major Disasters. This is a truly extraordinary thing. It's not a treaty. It's based on goodwill. But when there is a major disaster, so an earthquake, a hurricane, massive floods, a big oil spill, whatever, and the government of the country in which this disaster is located needs the very best satellite imagery to help them respond effectively, right? Which roads are still open, right? Where is the worst damage, right? Which runways can we still use to get airplanes in, right? Which bridges have fallen across canals that we can no longer access? Just need that kind of information, right? How bad is the flooding? Where are people on the roofs of their houses needing to be saved, right? You need the very best imagery from the satellite that's in the very best position at that particular moment in time, and that might not be one of your satellites, especially if you're not a rich, developed country. So under the Disasters Charter, the country in which the disaster happens only has to make one phone call. And a professional, highly trained responder will take the request, will look at their screen, determine which satellites are the best satellites in the best position, and will task those satellites, even though they belong to another country or to a foreign private company. And everyone has agreed that if they are tasked, that they will prioritize that mission over whatever money-making or security operation that that satellite was doing then. Because it's about saving lives. And they won't just provide the imagery, they will develop the imagery, they will process it to provide maximum utility, and they will get it to the people who need it within just a few hours. It's incredibly effective. And the United Nations humanitarian bodies can do this as well, can make those requests and get that imagery. The countries that provide the imagery and the companies that provide the imagery do so for free. Right? These are satellites that can make like $100,000 an hour, right? Or more. And they're taking them off of their money-making or their security tasks, and they're using them to save lives. Now, if that doesn't sound amazing enough, let me tell you something else. A year ago, there were massive floods in the Russian Far East. So the Ukraine war is happening. We have incredibly deep, broad sanctions on Russia, right? That, like, they are our enemies, right? They're committing massive war crimes in Ukraine, right? Bad country. We don't like Russia. Major floods in the Russian Far East. Russia puts out a call for imagery. Well, guess who stepped up? Canadian Space Agency, NASA, European Space Agency. We all provided imagery to help save Russian civilians in distress. That's a pretty awesome story, isn't it? So when I look at the space dynamic, and I can allow myself to be terrified, we're not particularly good in dealing with tragedies of the commons. We've pretty much screwed up on climate change. I see these glimmers of hope, right? That for some reason in space, we found ways to cooperate. Right? We've found ways to save lives, to work together, to preserve safe access for everyone, to enable amazing scientific discoveries. Right? It's either a good story or a bad story, depending on which angle you look at it. Right? And I'm terrified by what the next 4 years are going to look like as a result of the election of Donald Trump. And I'm terrified by the fact that the wealthiest person in the world, who happens to be the dominant actor in space, has got his ear right now. That's all terrifying. But I think this story lasts longer than a human lifetime. And I think that our common sense of aspiration and hope and unity in this broader universe and the incredible opportunities that exist in space will mean that gradually we'll come together and sort some of it out. I'm not someone who says we should just go and put human communities on Mars and get rid of Earth. Earth is a treasure, right? We can breathe. There's water, right? We're protected from incredible amounts of radiation by a magnetic sphere and a magnetic field and by our atmosphere. This is like the special place. We have evolved for this planet. But I still want to see human beings on Mars, right? I still want humans to go back to the moon. I still want people in Nunavut to have broadband. And I want Inuit hunters and prospectors and adventurers to have access to instant search and rescue. There's so much good that still comes of this and more that can come. But the thing that I continually tell people is that although it's easy to get enthusiastic about space, whether it's enthusiastic about the adventure, enthusiastic about all the money we're going to make, enthusiastic about how we're going to dominate space and become a new superpower, ultimately, if you're not paying attention to risk, none of those dreams will come true. So it's the risk element. I'm the risk guy. That's my message. If we're smart, if we're aware of risk, then we can mitigate it, then we can solve problems and move forward together. I think we have some time for questions. Okay.
So we're gonna, am I on? Hi. We're gonna have these passed around. David will have one. I'll have another one over here when Joel tells me. Good?
Yep.
Let me start it off while you're walking, Elizabeth, because I've got a question, Michael, that comes from a couple of things you said. So you've described...
Sorry, that's me blowing my nose.
We've got that on tape now. I'm never going to unhear that. The rhetorical question was who owns space, and you answered that in part with your analogy of the commons. You've also described rules that apply in the form of treaties or norms or understanding or the product of cooperation. But you started off your talk by saying you had a story which in a classic sense had a villain. So villains are people who don't follow rules or norms or order or laws or rules. So if we're going to follow that metaphor, where's the hero in the story, and how does the hero have an impact in this world of outer space?
Before you answer, move your chair up. We're worried. Somebody told me you're going to fall off the edge there. Just pull it up.
Well, the easiest way to solve that problem is
Perfect. Thank you.
for me to stand up so the people in the back can see me, right? Villains and heroes. Look, in every industry, there's always a push and pull between companies who want to maximize shareholder value and governments who are trying to protect the public interest by steering commercial activity in safe and sustainable ways. That's true in every single field of economic activity. So it should be the same in space, right? The problem, or at least one of the problems with Elon Musk, is that he and his company have been moving so quickly that the regulators have not been able to keep up. So years ago, the Federal Communications Commission in the United States decided that they didn't have to do environmental impact assessments for satellites because there's no environment in space. And now we know that what happens in space affects the environment on Earth, whether it's the light pollution affecting nocturnal animals, whether it's the changes that are now occurring to the upper atmosphere. I mean, the list goes on and on. We know there are environmental impacts, and so different actors have been pushing the FCC to start doing environmental impact assessments. And SpaceX has hired the world's most expensive law firm, Skadden Arps, I'm looking at the lawyer here, to represent them, to litigate like crazy to stop the FCC from making any change. They have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on legal fees to fight, including in US federal court, to keep the regulator at bay. In Boca Chica, Texas, SpaceX has been building and testing what will be by far the world's largest rocket, Starship, previously known as BFR. Let you work that one out. and the Federal Aviation Authority, which is responsible for rocket launches, and the Environmental Protection Agency have been questioning the environmental impacts of blowing up really big rockets, especially close to an estuary. And Elon Musk has been fighting back against these regulatory agencies. He hates these regulatory agencies. They're getting in the way of his goals, which are both financial and, dare I say it, political. And I think he realized that if Kamala Harris became president, that these agencies would continue to nip at his heels, would continue to cause him problems. So what's the easiest way to deal with the regulatory agencies? Well, it's to eliminate them through the Department of Government Efficiency, which he now co-leads as a result of the election of Donald Trump. And for the world's richest man, this was a pretty cost-effective election intervention. So I think it's partly about space. And one last thing, just to demonstrate, just demonstrate how far-sighted Elon Musk is. If you want to become a subscriber to his Starlink internet service, you have to sign a user's agreement. And down, buried in the small print, is a provision that says, by signing this agreement, you agree that Mars is a free planet beyond the jurisdiction of any Earth nation state. He's clever. I'll give that to him, right? But the regulatory agencies need to catch up. And if the American agencies won't be able to do it in the next 4 years, then it's got to be regulatory agencies in places like Canada and Japan and Europe to try to slow this down, to try to bring some rationality into this process. And hopefully there'll be another American election.
Sorry about that. Hello? Okay. I have a question of what I see as a conflict of interest. We had a talk about the race, or going back to the moon, and the United States wanting to do that, or regulatory agents. Now you're telling me that Musk is putting all this garbage in the sky. Is there an agency that's tracking where all this stuff is? And how will they get through it to get to the moon?
You're not an astrophysicist, are you? Because you could be. That's a really good question. When space agencies and rocket companies launch rockets today, one of their considerations when they're choosing the time to launch actually concerns debris. Right? They know where these rocket bodies are, the big pieces, and they literally launch to steer their way through, to find that hole through the debris already today. And it will get worse, absolutely. So that is a problem. On the moon, I haven't spoken much about the moon. The Obama administration decided to refocus NASA on the moon. The previous focus had been on Mars, and the moon was more achievable in a shorter time frame. And then Donald Trump came to power in his first term and decided that while he was president, he wanted to see human beings step on the moon again, so he supported the moon. Elon Musk has never been interested in the moon. He's interested in Mars because it's actually a better planet. Like it's not, the moon's not a planet, it's a celestial object. But Mars is interesting for a whole bunch of reasons that the moon is not, including the fact that you could actually imagine long-term human existence on Mars with a lot of technology and short lifespans. So he wants to go to Mars, and I'm expecting that in the next few months we will find that NASA's space launch system and its Artemis spacecraft program will be shut down, and that the money for those very expensive programs will be redirected to SpaceX to take us to Mars. And that will be a really bad day when that's announced, because Jeremy Hansen, Canadian astronaut, is due to fly on Artemis 2 around the moon later this year. But no, Musk is not interested in the moon, and he has the ear of the incoming president. So yeah, we're going to Mars, my prediction. And yes, as Musk has admitted, people will die. It's hard. It's a long ways away.
Before I go home and cancel my Starlink subscription, I do have one quick question, and I'm not a physicist. You're going to understand that quickly. So you said that when the reentry of this material happens, it breaks up into little aluminum pieces. Does any of it turn gaseous?
So it actually ends up in aerosols in the upper atmosphere. The upper atmosphere, so the atmosphere that we think about, the atmosphere, the troposphere where airplanes fly and weather happens, right? That's really close to the Earth, right? I'm talking 40 kilometers, 50 kilometers above that. It's very dry, and because of that, there's not much precipitation through that column, so stuff stays there for a long time. So in 2021, Aaron Boley and I wrote an article about these big satellite constellations, like Starlink, and we were just identifying different issues, things that needed more research. It was a big picture article, and we put in 2 paragraphs about the possibility that all of this burning up would actually change the chemistry of the upper atmosphere in potentially negative ways. And we mentioned changes to the climate system and potential changes to the ozone layer, but we couldn't prove it. And we got pushback from SpaceX and Amazon and a couple other big space companies. Like, this is speculation. You shouldn't be publishing this. It's almost defamation. You have no proof. We didn't, right? Someone at NASA must have read the article, because in March 2023, they sent a WB-57, which is a 1950s era high altitude reconnaissance plane, up to Alaska, because in March of each year, stratospheric air is forced down towards the pole. And if you can get up to 60,000 feet, you can sample the stratospheric air. So they did that. And then they ran it through a mass spectrometer. There is very little naturally occurring aluminum in the upper atmosphere. Meteoroids are mostly oxygen. There's very little aluminum in them. 10% of the aerosols that they found from the stratosphere in March 2023 contained alumina particles. Now, that doesn't prove anything, but they also found some other elements that were unexpected, including some obscure alloys that are used in the making of the nozzles of rocket engines. So the entire sort of atmospheric chemistry community, which is tens of thousands of people worldwide, are now fixated on this issue and trying to figure out what's going on. Is it actually happening? What are the consequences of this? Is there a risk to the global climate system? Is there a risk to the ozone layer? I can't answer whether it's definitively a risk or not, but if it is a serious risk, the response on Earth is to slow down or stop while the scientists figure it out. It's called the precautionary principle. That's not going to happen with regards to SpaceX, because SpaceX is incorporated in the United States, and, well, Elon Musk is going to eliminate the FCC, or some such thing. I mean, I'm actually terrified by this, because if the worst case scenario is true, then we need to think about some kind of limits on the amount of mass that we're putting into Earth orbit, or at least in terms of how we're disposing of it. And that conversation is not going to get very far as long as Elon Musk is controlling this issue within the US government. That's why I said this was terrifying, right? But I want to be optimistic also, because I can give you literally dozens of examples about how humanity has faced really big challenges and have used science-based information and international cooperation to find ways through. I mentioned the Montreal Protocol. I'll give you just another example. For decades, environmental activists lobbied for governments to require that oil tankers be built with 2 hulls instead of 1 hulls, double hull tankers. And the global shipping industry said, no, not too expensive. Can't do it. It would like force us all into bankruptcy, right? No progress whatsoever. And then the Exxon Valdez accident happened. And there was a public outcry in the United States that this is unacceptable, something has to change. Within a year, the United States had banned all single-hulled tankers from US ports. Within the next 2 years, the International Maritime Organization had changed the regulations under a global treaty to require that all new tankers have double hulls. Why do we hear of so few massive maritime oil spills today as compared to the 1960s and the 1970s and the 1980s? Yeah? It's because of the Exxon Valdez and the international response, although led, importantly, by the United States of America. Right. Any other?
Question here?
Yeah, please.
So basically, you say like Elon Musk, he's like pretty scary, he's lots of power and stuff like that. What's stopping more of these people from just popping up?
Yeah. Jeff Bezos has his own rocket company, although he, I don't think he's as smart as Elon Musk. There are other people with growing power and influence in the space domain, but it's the combination of the vision with regards to the potential of technology and the sheer force of will that Mr. Musk has to get things done that have turned him into such a giant disruptor, right? And let me be clear, I give him credit for a bunch of things, right? He made electric cars sexy, right? So that rich people wanted to buy electric cars. And that then generated the revenue to build more electric cars. And that, in turn, made the established automakers worldwide go, holy cow, we better start making electric cars. Okay? He transformed the global automobile market in the direction of electric. And by doing so, probably made the single greatest contribution to fighting climate change of any human being. Okay? I'll give him that credit. Okay? But he's a complex character. I mean, I have bad days, I have good days. Everyone here has a fault. All of you are wonderful in other ways, right? He's a human being. He's just a human being that has incredible drive and incredible vision, incredible intelligence, and is fixed on a goal, which really is about taking humans to Mars. And then now, I think he's probably, altering his brain chemistry in various ways and getting drunk on power and money, which does change people. right? I don't think he's the same person that I first noticed a decade ago. But if there are history books written in 3 centuries, right, Elon Musk will be chapter 1. He's a globally historic figure. There's no doubt about that. And may you live in interesting times. You're going to have a wild ride because you're under the age of 30.
Okay, a few more questions? We'll start here and then, okay, thanks.
Hi, I was just wondering what the costs associated with retrieving stuff from space would be, like all the space debris.
Yes. There are lots of startup companies that have plans for sending up spacecraft to retrieve space debris. And they're all trying to get contracts from national space agencies to demonstrate their ability to do so. So in order to retrieve a piece of space debris, you need to launch another rocket. So it's expensive and it's probably not that environmental. So, some people are trying to collect plastics from the ocean. There's even a big ship that goes around showing people it can be done. And you have the opportunity to donate to the ship to support its efforts. But why not just stop putting the stuff there in the first place, right? So let me give you a simple example. Aaron Boley and I have an amazing PhD student whose name is Ewan Wright, whose PhD is about reentries. And one of his big takeaways, well, the PhD hasn't been finished, but one of the big takeaways will be that with regards to rockets, we now have the technology and the mission designs so that we don't need to leave them in orbit. We don't necessarily need to land them on 4 legs like SpaceX, but we can direct them towards the remote South Pacific Ocean, right? Which is not without some environmental consequence, but probably less environmental consequence than leaving them to come back in an uncontrolled way or collide with another rocket body or satellite. So he has been pushing for national regulators to require controlled reentries and has been pushing for governments that contract for space launches to only do so with companies that can guarantee a controlled reentry. The first entity that accepted his recommendation was the US Space Force, which contracts for a lot of private companies to do stuff. And they will only contract for a space launch if the company can guarantee that the rocket stage will come back and either land on 4 legs or go into the ocean. Changes in practice. And the Federal Aviation Authority in the United States is proposing a similar rule for all launches from the United States. The French government is doing so also. Okay? This is a PhD student, right? Because it's a cutting edge issue. There is a option for mitigation, right? And just like moving off chlorofluorocarbons, there's technology available to do it right. So again, there's a little bit of optimism there. But again, instead of trying to collect the plastic from the ocean, why don't we just stop putting plastic in the ocean, right? It's as simple as that.
I just wondered what the impact is on Earth to all the launches that have occurred and will occur. Is anyone studying that?
Yes. His name is Marty Ross. He's been studying this for 20 years. He works at the Aerospace Corporation, which is a think tank based in Los Angeles. He became interested in this because of the space shuttle. Because the space shuttle was like 2 big boosters and the main engines with the massive fuel tank, and was studying the emissions going up and studying the hole in the ionosphere that the shuttle would punch, right? And so in terms of going up, it's not actually the carbon dioxide emissions that are the problem. because compared to international aviation or ground transportation, it's still a tiny percentage, right, of the CO2 from rocket launches. Problem is that the rocket continues up through the troposphere and gets up into the stratosphere, and it's still going, right? So it's now in a zone that's very dry, where there is no precipitation, where there's actually a fairly low density of molecules as you go higher. And if it's a kerosene-fueled rocket, like a Falcon 9, or if it's a solid booster on the side of a Atlas V, which burns synthetic solid fuel, that rocket's putting a huge amount of black soot into the upper atmosphere. We don't know what that does, but it's loading the atmosphere with black soot in a place where there really isn't much of anything, but it's still part of our atmosphere. If you say, okay, we're going to avoid that problem by using hydrogen, well, then you're putting a ton of water into the very dry upper atmosphere, and you're creating new clouds at high altitudes that probably have their own effects. So the point of all this is that there's no such thing as a green rocket fuel, right? There's no such thing as space activity that is without environmental impact. I'm not proposing that we stop all environmental impacts in space. We have to mitigate them. We have to find the least destructive ways of acting. And that requires an awful lot of science. And then it requires that policymakers actually pay attention to the scientists. And then it requires that the policymakers have the courage to take on these really big companies. And that's a complex mix of things. But again, we've done it before, right? We have done it so many times. Think about the way the pharmaceutical industry has been regulated over the decades, right, to ensure pretty high safety in places like Canada and the United States. I could go on, but we know how to do this. We just have never thought about doing it in space, and now we're in a race with very fast-moving companies that have a whole lot of money and now a huge amount of political influence. So I tell my students, I'll tell all of you, that, yeah, it's terrifying, but there's reason for hope, and while we hold out hope, it's also incredibly interesting, right? And if you understand it, then you can find those silver linings, right, to hold on to as we move forward. So I'm really big into public education, public learning about these matters, because knowledge is a form of power, and it's a way of still feeling hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sure on the way home in the car, I'm going to have a conversation about our Starlink account also, just saying that.
It's okay, as long as you're an Inuit hunter, it's totally cool.
Okay, I thank you so much for coming and joining us, especially as someone who appreciates lifelong learning, how important it is. Probably this is among the most important lectures we've ever had. So I think I can't say enough about how valuable this learning was for us tonight, and we will cling to that glimmer of hope. And the fact that there are not one but two students here tonight makes me feel better about our future. Michael's book is available, and he also, I'm sure, will speak to people who want to have it signed. Before we turn to that, I'd just like to say one last thing. You may have read about our next program, tentatively called Our Digital Future, in spring 2025. We're going to workshop the name a little bit so that we'll call it Beyond the Doom and Gloom, or maybe There's Good News Too with AI, something to bring people back, because we don't want to be known as Northumberland Learning Connection that scares the hell out of you every time. We also are hoping to have the journalist and author Elizabeth Renzetti, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, join us for a winter Zoom event to explore the most pressing issues facing women in terms of equality, with her trademark humor and heart. So please, over the break, because we won't see you for a few months, tell your friends and family about NLC, and thank you, and good night. And thank you again, Michael.